You step onto a Paris pitch with salt still trapped in your clothes. The ocean crossing is behind you. The crowd expects a curiosity from a country many spectators could not find on a map. Then the ball starts moving. It is May 1924, and your sky blue shirt belongs to Uruguay. European football still imagines itself as the center of the game, yet within minutes your team is passing through Yugoslavia as if the pitch has been measured in advance. 7 goals arrive. None are answered. How did one of South America's smallest countries become the first national team to rule the entire football world? The easy answer is talent. The better answer begins much earlier, in the streets, schools, docks, and crowded clubs of Montevideo. British workers and teachers had carried football to Uruguay during the 19th century, but the local population did not simply copy the imported game. The sport moved out of expatriate circles and into a young society filled with immigrants, workers, students, and children who needed a common language. What could unite them faster than a ball? By the early 20th century, football had become part of how Uruguay imagined itself. Club Nacional represented a proudly local response to teams created around foreign communities and companies. Peñarol grew from the railway world and became its great rival. Matches between clubs were not polite exhibitions anymore. They were public arguments about neighborhood, class, identity, and belonging. In The Ball is Round, historian David Goldblatt helps place this rise inside a wider Uruguayan project of education, urban life, and national confidence. That social foundation mattered because Uruguay was not selecting 11 men from a narrow elite. The game was spreading across a compact capital where strong players met each other constantly. Schools encouraged physical education. Clubs created competition. The national team could therefore combine different backgrounds inside the same sky blue shirt, including black players at a time when many football institutions elsewhere remained deeply exclusionary. Was Uruguay's greatest advantage already visible before tactics even entered the story? The tactical answer began with a formation that now looks absurd on paper. Uruguay commonly used the 2-3-5, 2 defenders, 3 midfielders, and 5 forwards. In plain English, that meant half the team appeared to stand in attacking positions. But formations are only starting points, and Uruguay made those fixed numbers move. Players exchanged positions, passed short, supported the ball carrier, and treated space as something the whole team could create together. Jonathan Wilson's Tactical History, Inverting the Pyramid, explains how early football gradually moved away from rigid lines toward more connected systems. Uruguay accelerated that idea without needing a modern tactics screen. A defender could step forward. A halfback could guide the rhythm. A forward could drop toward the ball instead of waiting beside the goal. To European eyes accustomed to more direct play, the same old formation suddenly looked like a new sport. At the center stood José Leandro Andrade. He was a wing half, a role position between defense and attack, and he controlled space with timing rather than brute force. French crowds saw speed, balance, elegance, and an awareness of angles that seemed years ahead of the era. Newspapers turned him into the face of the tournament, and he became football's first black global superstar. But could one dazzling player explain an entire machine? Beside Andrade stood Captain José Nasazzi, the organizer who gave the team its spine. Héctor Scarone supplied invention near goal. Pedro Petrone attacked with direct power. Pedro Cia connected moves and arrived where defenders had stopped looking. Uruguay did not have one solution. It had several players who understood the same footballing grammar. The journey to Paris had nearly failed before it began. Funding was uncertain, and officials had taken serious financial risks to send the team across the Atlantic. Uruguay arrived as the only South American entrant, played warm-up matches in Spain, and kept winning. By the time the Olympic tournament started, the players were no longer tourists. They were carrying evidence. First came the 7-0 destruction of Yugoslavia. Then the United States lost 3-0. Host nation France fell 5-1 in front of a crowd that had begun to understand what it was seeing. The Netherlands pushed Uruguay harder, but the sky blue shirts survived 2-1. Could Switzerland stop them in the final? Nearly 50,000 spectators watched Uruguay answer with a 3-0 victory. The score mattered, but the impression mattered more. Gabriel Hanot, the former France international who later became one of Europe's most influential football journalists, saw a team operating at a different level of mobility and technique. The old assumption that the best football had to come from Europe had been broken in public. Uruguay had not merely won gold, it had changed the map of the sport. The celebration also produced one of football's earliest signature rituals. After victory, the Uruguayans walked around the field to salute the crowd. That circuit became known as the Olympic lap, the Vuelta Olímpica, a phrase still used across South American football. The team had arrived almost unknown and left behind a global tradition. How many champions create a language for celebrating before they even return home? 4 years later, doubt returned. Perhaps Paris had been a surprise. Perhaps European teams had learned. Perhaps Argentina, Uruguay's neighbor and fiercest rival, now had the stronger generation. Amsterdam in 1928 offered the answer. Uruguay beat the Netherlands 2-0, Germany 4-1, and Italy 3-2. Argentina reached the final from the other side. The first match ended 1-1 after extra time, so the teams had to meet again 3 days later. This was not a penalty shootout era. A drawn final meant another full match. How much control remains when exhaustion, rivalry, and history are all pressing on the same legs? In the replay, Uruguay won 2-1. Roberto Figueroa scored first. Argentina equalized through Luis Monti, and Scarone struck the decisive goal. 2 Olympic tournaments had brought 2 titles. At the time, those FIFA-run senior competitions were the closest thing football possessed to a world championship, which is why Uruguay still honors both victories with stars above its crest. The second triumph changed more than Uruguay's reputation. FIFA had already approved the creation of a separate World Cup, a tournament that could become football's true global championship. Uruguay now had the strongest sporting claim to host it, and the year 1930 carried political meaning because the country was marking a century since its first constitution. The champions offered to build the stage. Could the smallest giant also build football's future? The Estadio Centenario became the answer in concrete. More than 1,000 workers labored in shifts, but heavy rain delayed construction, and the stadium was not ready when the tournament began. It finally opened on July 18, 1930, with Uruguay beating Peru 1-0. Its stands were named in part for Colombes and Amsterdam, the places where the 2 Olympic titles had been won. The building itself turned memory into architecture. Only 13 teams entered the first World Cup, and several European nations stayed away because the journey was long and expensive. That makes the tournament easy to underestimate today. Yet every World Cup tradition had to begin somewhere. The host pressure, the national flags, the radio reports, the arguments about referees, and the feeling that one match could define a country. Uruguay was not entering an established spectacle. It was helping invent one. The hosts beat Peru 1-0 and Romania 4-0 without conceding. In the semifinal, Yugoslavia scored first, but Uruguay answered 6 times. Argentina also reached the final with a perfect record. Once again, the River Plate rivals would decide who controlled the football world. Now you are inside the Centenario on July 30th. More than 60,000 people fill the concrete bowl. Argentina wants to use its own ball, Uruguay wants another, and referee Jean Languinis settles the dispute by allowing 1 ball in each half. Even the object at the center of the game has become part of the rivalry. What happens when the hosts lose control of their own final? Pablo Dorado gives Uruguay the lead after 12 minutes. Argentina responds through Carlos Pucel and Guillermo Stabile. At halftime, Uruguay trails 2-1, and the first World Cup appears to be leaving the host nation. The dressing room is not facing a tactical mystery. It is facing fear. Coach Alberto Sapici is only 31, still the youngest coach ever to win a World Cup. Whatever he says, Uruguay emerges with greater control and greater belief. Cia equalizes. Santos Iriarte drives in the third. Hector Castro, known as the one-armed player after losing part of his right arm in childhood, heads the 4th goal and seals a 4-2 victory. Uruguay is now Olympic champion again, and the first World Cup champion. 3 consecutive global tournaments have produced the same winner. This is what a superpower looks like before television contracts, airline travel, sports science, and global scouting. But the most important twist is what that power was built upon. Modern memory often reduces Uruguay to Guerra Chirrua, the fierce refusal to accept defeat. That quality is real, and later generations turned it into a national footballing code. Yet the team that first conquered the world did not begin with desperation. It began with technical superiority, coordinated movement, social inclusion, and the confidence to play rather than merely survive. Eduardo Galeano later transformed Uruguay's football memory into literature and football in Sun and Shadow. Brian Glanville preserved the early World Cups as part of a longer global story. Their work helps you see that 1924, 1928, and 1930 were not disconnected miracles. They were one continuous argument. A small country could master an imported game, reshape it, and then teach the world how modern football could feel. That argument survived even when Uruguay disappeared from the next 2 World Cups. It survived long enough to return in Brazil in 1950, where Captain Obdulio Verla led another sky blue team into the Maracanã against overwhelming favorites. Brazil needed only a draw in the decisive final round match and led 1-0. Uruguay answered through Juan Schiaffino and Alcides Giglia, won 2-1, and silenced the stadium in the match, remembered as the Maracanazo. Was that an isolated shock, or the final proof that Uruguay's first empire had never been based on size? You still see the inheritance whenever Uruguay plays. The distances between players stay small. The duel feels personal. The shirt carries 4 stars: Paris, Amsterdam, Montevideo, and the Maracanã. Opponents may have larger populations, richer leagues, and deeper squads, but Uruguay enters with a historical memory that tells every player the same thing. You are never only facing 11 men. You are facing a football culture built before the World Cup had a past. You are facing the country that taught a global game to stop looking only toward Europe. And when you step onto that pitch, the salt is no longer trapped in Uruguay's clothes. It is carried in the memory of every ocean the first superpower crossed.